Often when we do the study of philosophy or religion, the best is when we take the challenge of seeing the world through the eyes of those that we study. Ideas which might strike us, at least at first, as strange or otherwise incomprehensible come into much sharper focus by doing our utmost to apply the principle of charity as we read or contemplate ancient ideas. Modern eyes are not and cannot be medieval or ancient eyes. Even looking up at the night sky dramatically reveals the difference in our eyes. We both see the same things, more or less, and at the same time we see something radically different. My eyes peer up into the dark where there is no center. The dots of lights are terrestrial and gaseous planets and vast nuclear furnaces hung in a vacuum, all underwritten by a sea of quantum fluctuations, all perhaps hurtling into the night of proton decay sometime 10 to the 100 or so years from now. Medieval intellectuals saw nothing of the sort. Among some of those intellectuals, their world was the center of all things, but space was certainly no vacuum. Rather, it was populated by innumerable spiritual beings and intelligences which propelled and motivated forces whose influence could be felt directly on the world below. Those creatures, from disembodied celestial intelligence to beneficent angels and, of course, malevolent demons, were also far, far from being indifferent to the human world. Indeed, with the correct technology, a human could both hail and command these beings just as we can capture and control the ghostly electrons floating through this camera and your computer. Manuals for this technology, while repressed by medieval authorities, actually have come down to us. In these tomes are complex instructions for summoning and controlling the power of vast supernatural beings who dwell in the upper reaches of medieval reality. One of the most popular and influential was eventually entitled the Heptameron, literally 7 days, and was attributed to Peter of Abano, a famed 13th century polymath. In it we find a carefully composed system by which a team of sorcerers carefully purify themselves and almost mathematically employ a complex interlocking series of rituals, incantations, exorcisms, and magically empowered circles to invoke, bind, and wield the power of those who dwell in the firmament and the celestial regions above the earth. It is perhaps because of its relatively systematic and clear nature that the Heptameron became one of the most popular manuals of medieval angel magic and deeply influenced magical and occult thought all the way down to this day. If you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe and also check out my other content on topics in esotericism. Also, if you want to support work like this of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube for free, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I do appreciate your consideration of supporting the project of making esoterica like this available to the public. Now, let's turn to the Heptameron, one of the most important medieval guides to summoning and controlling the realm of the celestial, the angelic, and the demonic. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One common misconception about the Middle Ages is that it was absolutely dominated by the Church, such that a Gestapo-like Inquisition rooted out and destroyed any and all heterodoxy, burning books and people in the process. Now, this conception isn't totally a misconception. The medieval church did their share of burning books and people to stamp out what it perceived as heretical. There's not much doubt about that. But that process was by no means absolute, and heterodox people and their beliefs did survive, and even downright forbidden books of, for instance, sorcery and so-called black magic or necromancy did survive all the way down to this period. In fact, hundreds of such books, both in manuscript and in print, are held in various libraries and private collections throughout the world, including in the Vatican archives, where they are surprisingly easily accessible, and the odds of you getting burned alive by taking a look at them are relatively low. One such volume that survives in numerous editions, both in manuscript and print, is a manual of celestial, angelic, and demonic magic, now known as the Heptameron, and traditionally attributed to Peter of Abano. The earliest reference to the Heptameron dates to around 1508 by the abbot Johannes Trithemius, who you also may know as the developer of various forms of cryptography and angelic message transmission. He was also the tutor and confidant of Cornelius Agrippa, the writer of the famed 3 books of occult philosophy, which you can check out my episode in the card above about that. However, the text itself seems to have been created using elements from much earlier magical systems, some of which reach back into the early Middle Ages and even beyond, perhaps all the way back to ancient Jewish and Islamic, even pagan magic. These include the Liber Raziales, the Key of Solomon literature, the rather early Quator Annulis tradition, the Liber Semiphoras. This is a tradition of very powerful names of God, perhaps revealed to Moses and maybe originating in Jewish magical circles. Also included here would be the very highly influential Liber Iuratus, or the Sworn Book of Honorius, and elements of astral magic, which may have their origins back in the Islamic world in literature like the famed Picatrix. More proximately, we can say that the standard printed edition of the Heptameron is itself reliant on a previous group of manuscripts that we can denote as the Lucidarium Artis Nigromantice, or the Elucidation of Necromancy, but more on that tradition in just a moment. The text as we know it as the Heptameron was probably first printed in 1559, but maybe earlier, and it was first printed in English with some alterations in 1655 by Robert Turner, alongside and in addition to the so-called Fourth Book of Occult Philosophy by Pseudo-Agrippa. Attributed to Agrippa, we're fairly confident that he didn't write it. In short, the Heptameron is a system of magic whereby a complex magical circle is created in which a range of spiritual creatures with various kinds of powers are summoned through magic rituals such that the power and knowledge of those beings, angels, celestials, and demons, can be further elicited. Now, before getting into the text a bit more, what I want to do is get us a little bit better situated both historically and magically. The world of the Heptameron is a geocentric universe in which the realm above the earth is variously populated with angels, demons, and what may be called celestial intelligences, or as the actual text has it, celestial angels, aerial spirits, and planetary spirits. The angels and demons here, or the aerial spirits, should be more or less straightforward. They're basically divine workers, the angels that is. They are the messengers and militia of which some, led by Satan, rebelled and are usually various kinds of evil. Now, just because they're evil doesn't mean they aren't useful, and in this magical theory and many magical theories of the Middle Ages, such beings should and could be bent to the will of the righteous Magus. Thus, summoning a demon or an aerial spirit, as a Heptameron would have it, would be no different than taming a wild animal to be in the service of the Magus. It just happens to be a astral or aerial wild animal. Now, this concept was very at home in the medieval world that basically felt that non-human animals could be used in any way that humans saw fit. Now, we may morally bristle at such an idea, but history is history. The celestial intelligences, or planetary spirits, are a bit more complicated, but these are beings or spirits. They certainly can't be said to have physical bodies, to be sure, and are typically responsible for a complex web of sympathies by which the motion of the universe causes effects both above the earth and on the earth, from the changing of the seasons to the weather to astrological impressions, which give rise to individual, temperaments and personalities. Obviously, such beings would wield tremendous power, basically the power over nature itself, and wielding such power was the chief aim of, both medieval magic and modern science in many ways. So how does one wield such power in this system? Well, to simplify a lot, by employing powerful rituals largely taking over from Christian liturgy, especially the liturgy around the exorcism, and by manipulating the sympathetic structure of reality, one can actually correctly align ritual space and time to hail one of these beings in such a way as to compel their service. Now, why would such a being care about being compelled by a human being? Because in this worldview, human beings are uniquely set aside ontologically. We are made in the image of God, which gives us a specific advantage over other kinds of beings, both non-human animals and non-human spirits. And because of the spiritual mechanics of this reality more generally. In a way, these beings are compelled by the rituals of texts like the Heptameron in the same way that electromagnetism can be compelled by the engineer. The universe is simply structured in such a manner that if one learns the inner occult or hidden sympathetic mechanisms, it simply must behave in such and such a manner. Though it seems that electromagnetism is a bit more predictable than, demons, not that that makes Maxwell's equations or the Lorentz force laws any easier to master in your physics classes. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, the text has two key moments in its recension history. The first is as the Elucidation of Necromancy, whose exact period of composition is pretty difficult to pin down, but probably between the 14th and the 13th centuries. I tend to be more on the 15th century camp myself. This text survives in various manuscripts of various degrees of agreement, despite whose core magical system is still recognizably united, if, again, not totally consistent, but this is pretty common for these medieval books of magic. Get this, one of those manuscripts was even said to have been found after demolishing a chimney in an old mental asylum in Ghent, along with some other magical implements. Yeah, a book of necromancy found in a chimney of an insane asylum. This Evil Dead sequel just writes itself. Hey, Sam Raimi, if you're out there, brother, you need to hit me up. Come talk to me. Another copy is actually held by the Vatican Archives, which is, as you imagine, so secretive and gatekeeping that it's readily accessible online. Despite what you may have read in a Dan Brown novel or over there in Conspiracy Land, the Vatican Archives, aside from recent papal papers, are downright accessible for credentialed scholars. In fact, I get the sense they want more people there to look through them, because they, the Vatican, often don't even know what's in their own archives. For instance, a random manuscript copy of Spinoza's Ethics was actually found there by scholars a few years ago that no one, even the Vatican itself, seemed to know was even in their archives. Regardless, a solid showings of the manuscripts of the Elucidation of Necromancy survives in various copies. So, what's in this book of necromancy? Most of the text begin by providing a relatively comprehensive interlocking system of correspondences between various cycles of time, such as the hours of the day and night, the days of the week, the seasons, and the various registers of the spiritual creatures, their names, sigils, sympathetic incense, and their respective appearance and powers. This is kind of like a system of interlocking correspondences. These are all employed to create a pretty complex multi-tiered magical circle given the specific aim of the magus and the various entities which can accomplish that aim given their appointed time and correspondences. Here, a range of angels, demons, and celestial spirits can be invoked once this calculation is made. The system actually kind of reminds me of tumblers in a kind of vast supernatural lock. The text then turns its attention to the precise rituals, especially suffumigation, exorcisms, and incantations, along with the various kinds of vestments that one would wear in which and by which these beings are summoned. The magus and their team, yep, necromancy is a team sport here, are set within the magical circle and become surrounded by a virtual retinue of absolutely frightful beings who, if the rituals and purification succeed, can be bent to the will of the magus depending on the virtue or power of the beings being invoked. Though this is no easy task. Such beings use powerful illusions in order to attempt to test the mettle of the necromantic team, trying to force them out of the protective circle. While some manuscripts do depict a containment triangle to summon the spirits into, a bit like the later Lesser Key of Solomon, most simply described being just surrounded by a whirlwind of spiritual creatures who can only be overcome or tamed by the ritual purity and persistence of the magus. Most manuscripts detail the appearance of these beings and even what one can expect when their appearance is imminent. This is, to me, perhaps the spookiest element of the text. You can see various kinds of signs appearing upon these creatures that are going to show up. In fact, these signs are often weather-related, and most of the rituals described in the Elucidation of Necromancy are set outdoors in a relatively remote region, presumably far away from the prying eyes of, the Inquisition. You don't want to get burned alive, do you? Of course, like all medieval text and medieval magical text specifically, there is a substantial amount of variation between the editions. Angel names and their sigils vary. Some texts contain more or less rituals. Some texts include additional rituals, such as magical names of God alleged to have been revealed to Moses. This is the Semiphoros literature. There's also here accounts of various kinds of ritual furniture, especially a magical table, which is probably, very probably, an influence on the so-called Holy Table of Working developed during the Enochian sessions of Dr. John Dee. Some of them also include a path leading out of the circles. This path leads to an incense burner, I think, facing north, along with various numbers of different kinds of incense altars. It's even interesting to see that the text presents more or less internally censored or sanitized versions of itself in the varying manuscripts. Sometimes the text is simply entitled Lucidarium in Arte Magica, not mentioning necromancy there, Nigromantice, at all for obvious reasons. In other places, all of the spirits simply become angels. There are no celestial and demons, they're just all angels, thus, I'm sure, trying to head off the pass of any accusations of demonic summoning. Though if you read those texts a little closer, it's pretty clear that they're fallen angels, so there's that. In fact, the 1655 Robert Turner English edition just takes the path of prudence and just leaves out that whole Decaelo ejecti part. They were cast out of heaven because, nobody wants to be accused of summoning demons. So, who wrote the thing? Well, you guessed it. We have no idea. You're not going to sign your name to something like this. Both the Elucidation of Necromancy and the Heptameron are, however, universally attributed to Peter of Abano, though there is lots of compelling reason to doubt this attribution. But first, who was Peter of Abano? Well, a super fascinating medieval figure regardless of whether he composed the Elucidation of Necromancy. He was born in the mid-13th century. Peter was a itinerant philosopher, astrologer, medical doctor, and professor of medicine for at least a little while until he was accused of all kinds of stuff by the Inquisition. Twice. This principal work, the absolutely vast Conciliator Differentiarium, is something of a scholastic investigation into a wide range of medieval questions as they apply primarily to the philosophy of Aristotle, often through folks like Averroes, especially as it is taken up into the theory and practice of medicine. Of course, this would obviously involve the intersection of medicine and astrology in the Middle Ages, and to some degree discussions of magic, which frankly Peter doesn't have a great deal positive to say. Though one does have to admit that these sections come pretty close to astral magic. For instance, in Difference 113 and Difference 156, he kind of admits to a divine invocation under very specific astrological signs that he practiced twice to gain direct knowledge from God. Okay, and Difference 135 does actually include the angels of the various planets. His other major works concern a defense of astrology, the Lucidarium, which also does include some important bits of astral magic, though again, he would often go into this and say, no, this isn't really real, you shouldn't do this stuff. He also wrote a textbook on poisons. This guy is starting to fit the bill of a necromancer to you. You can see why they attributed this book to him. I get it. Well, surprise, not surprise, he was also brought to trial twice for heresy by the Inquisition, though the exact nature of the charges is no longer clear. There's debate about exactly what he did. From the denial of miracles, he may have sided with Aristotle over and against the Bible, which is sometimes referred to as radical Averroism, as that gets called now. Maybe he claimed that astrology determined prophetic inspiration. Sometimes he was just downright accused of being a necromancer. It's not clear what his alleged crime was at this point. Interestingly enough, however, one of the heretical aspects that we know he was accused of was the denial of the very existence of demons. So there's that. Now, his exact heretical position probably had more to do with his flirtations with radical Averroism and astrological determinism than anything else, at least as far as I can read the records. But he would actually die during his second trial. He would be found guilty, and his friends had to actually spirit away his corpse before it could be disinterred and burned. Yeah, they would even dig you up and burn you. These guys didn't play, y'all. Inquisition's serious. Now, there's no doubt that Peter did, in fact, have a pretty substantial knowledge of medieval magic and necromancy, and probably held some relatively heterodox views. In fact, some of the manuscripts of the Elucidation of Necromancy actually correct the text to bring it into line with a list of planetary angels that Peter describes in one of his books, and which he probably got from Jewish sources. You can add that to the list of things you can get in trouble with in the Middle Ages, reading Jewish sources like that. But given that we can tell from his otherwise Averroistic influenced philosophy, there doesn't seem to be a lot of intellectual room for him to have developed the kind of ritual magic we find in the Elucidation of Necromancy or in the later text of the Heptameron. He just didn't seem to even believe in demons, perhaps. Further, the texts of ritual magic are actually only attested centuries after his death, and we see very similar legends become attached to other figures in the Middle Ages, like Michael Scott, not that Michael Scott. Even alchemical texts get attributed to Thomas Aquinas or Maimonides, who, like Peter of Abano, actually held metaphysical and physical positions incommiserate with alchemy and, well, necromancy. Though one of my favorite medieval necromancy legends is that Peter actually had a crystal with 7 demons trapped inside of it, that anytime he had a question about anything related to the liberal arts, he could just use his crystal with his demons in it to like ask them whatever it's like Wikipedia, but better. Okay, so if not Peter of Abano, then who? Well, we don't know, and we probably can't know. Again, no one signs their name to documents like this. Probably my guess is it's one of our friends in the good old-fashioned clerical necromantic underground. If you want to learn more about the clerical necromantic underground and give me more opportunities to say that, you can check out this episode. But whoever wrote it had substantial knowledge of medieval magic, but also some knowledge of canon law, interestingly enough. We base this on the appearance of various kinds of legal jargon and phrases that appear throughout the text. That legal angle makes me think of perhaps an Italian milieu, but such language would have followed the path of the decretum and canon law since the founding of the University of Bologna in the late 11th century. Everybody kind of talked in canon law back then. Further, the text calls for vestments, masses to be said over various ritual implements, and the use of holy water, all of which would have been accessible most directly to someone in holy orders. Necromantic Underground. Whoever they were, they had a positively vast and encyclopedic knowledge of medieval magic, synthesizing nearly a dozen different magical texts and tradition into a single, relatively coherent system of magic. In fact, the original introduction of the texts, many of them make it clear that's the very purpose of the Elucidation of Necromancy, to produce a brief guide to the science of magic, which simplifies, clarifies, and systematizes the confusing array of magical texts out there. Well, out there in the Middle Ages, they've gotten a lot more confusing since then. The next key moment is the printed history of the text following the Elucidation of Necromancy manuscript period, as it's now become named the Heptameron, literally the 7 days, likely printed in 1559, though earlier editions are mentioned, but they might just either be lost to history or just cataloging errors. While primarily indebted to the Elucidation of Necromancy text tradition, the Heptameron does make some significant alterations to the text, though actually always kind of in the spirit of the purpose of the original text, which is unifying and systematizing a coherent magical system of spirit invocation. The most significant alteration to the Elucidation of Necromancy tradition here is grouping the major ritual contents into the days of the week, hence the name Heptameron, and providing clear charts for all the various spirits, giving the whole text a kind of streamlined, almost spreadsheet-like quality. It's like if your accountant had a necromancy side hustle. Hashtag necromancy side hustle. The text has also undergone a good bit of careful editing, to remove any traces of demon summoning, so that all of the spirits of the air, for instance, they just become angels, with the exorcism for the aerial spirits now clearly denoting that they were thrown out of heaven, edited, just right the hell out of there. Further, the descriptions of the spirits are shuffled over to the 4th book of Pseudo-Agrippa, along with other appendectical sections, which sometimes appear in the Elucidations of Necromancy, also excised. So that's the semiphoras and some of the magical furniture business. Along with some rituals that also come across as too, necromancy-y, such as the suffumication of the magister or the ritual leader, and some ritual bowing during the invocation. You don't want to look like you're bowing down to demons. Though these accessions actually remain in the spirit of the aim of the original text, again, to provide a clear systematic ritual for the invocation of the gamut of supernatural creatures which occupy the entire upper reaches above the earth and below the throne of God. In this way, the Heptameron tradition attempts to be as exhaustive, summons everything, as it is systematic and concise. This is really an amazing document, and especially in that regard. It even claims that it can correct other forms of magic using its system. It's really cool in that way. Given this, it's unsurprising that the Heptameron has gone on to become highly influential in magic ritual all the way down to this very day of modern occult practice. Though it doesn't get nearly the attention as texts like the Lesser Key of Solomon, especially the Goetia, which it clearly and deeply influenced, or the Enochian Sessions of John Dee, which again are probably being influenced by at least the magical tables found in one of those manuscripts of the Elucidation of Necromancy, one of those texts at which I think John Dee actually owned at one point. Of course, the influence of this text doesn't stop there. Numerous later grimoires were directly influenced by the Heptameron, and in many ways, the whole tradition of planetary and invocatory magic is largely downstream of this tradition, at least at some level. Of course, the Heptameron tradition is itself the result of the compiler borrowing from earlier traditions, and I especially look forward to looking at those specific texts in their own future episodes, especially the Liber Iuratus. I'm really looking forward to making that episode. All right, if you want to consult the Elucidation of Necromancy and the Heptameron, the absolute best edition is the recent one by the tireless and wonderful scholar Joseph Peterson, to whom anyone watching this channel actually owes a real debt of gratitude, whether you know it or not. His work of providing texts such as these over at his website, The Twilight Grotto, something I've looked at for years, over a decade, you can find the links below. It's just an amazing website. Make sure to support his work by purchasing his books and send him a donation if you've ever benefited from his website. It's just amazing. Of course, we have numerous other volumes of magic and necromancy from the Middle Ages to explore. But in the meantime, make sure to check out my other content and playlists on everything from alchemy to Kabbalah to magic in the ancient Near East. Also, again, if you find this project worthwhile, consider supporting my work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.